Why hello folks! Today we're gonna be looking at one of the new augment mods that are coming with this season of Nightwave. Specifically this one, the augment mod for the Gorgon. Metamorphic magazine. It gives a plus 90% magazine capacity, plus 90% ammo maximum, which is great because this is a weapon that it's a bullet hose, so you absolutely need a lot of bullets. But also, it has the effect of inflicting 20 cumulative attacks on an enemy will petrify them for 5 seconds, which is, appropriate for a weapon called the Gorgon. I have been testing this thing out to see what it can do, to see what it can't do, and the results are pretty interesting. These augment mods for weapons that have been handed down in previous Nightwave seasons have been kinda hit and miss, but this one definitely has a lot of things going for it to actually make it fairly interesting. For this build, or for these tests, I have been using the Prisma Gorgon. There are 3 different versions of the Gorgon. The Gorgon Wraith, and the Prisma Gorgon. The Prisma Gorgon is a barrow weapon. The Gorgon Wraith you farm from the Razorback, which, by the way, for everyone watching this video when it's brand new, the Razorback event just started. It's gonna go on for 3 more days as of this video being published. So if you just build a bunch of Razorback ciphers, which shouldn't be too hard, it requires an item called cryptographic ALU. It drops from Corpus Archwing missions. So if you just play Corpus Archwing missions, you can get that. There's one on Neptune, here, Salacia, the mobile defense one. That's the one people usually play. Just play that a couple of times, you get a bunch of cryptographic ALUs, you can craft your Razorback ciphers, you can play the Razorback event, you can farm for the Gorgon Wraith. The Prisma Gorgon is a barrow weapon, so that one only shows up whenever Barrow happens to have it in his stock. Now, I do think the Prisma Gorgon is slightly better. The Gorgon Wraith, it has a higher status chance, which is, not bad for this, because we're building it for, cold procs as well. And it's got higher base damage, but much lower crit chance, much lower crit multiplier. So if you do have the Prisma Gorgon, that is my go-to. The Gorgon Wraith is also a good choice, and the normal Gorgon is kinda butt. So first up, I'm going to talk a bit about the build I have here. Since we are using Metamorphic magazine, that means that we are losing out on 1 mod slot, which kinda means that with this build, or with this weapon, since we want to use galvanized aptitude as well, we definitely want to get more fire rate and more punch through in there. It means we only really have space for 1 elemental mod. In that case, I'm going to pick primed cryo rounds. It gives a slow effect, which, thematically fits with petrifying enemies. You slow them down, you petrify them, that's great. And it also gives us an opportunity to actually use the new arcane primary frostbite that you get from running the Varuna mission, the Circulus stuff, the conjunction survival missions on Lua. If you do that, you get a bunch of Lua Thraxplasm. You can go to Archimedean Yonta in the Zarman, and you can buy primary frostbite. This triggers on cold status effects. It gives a buff of crit damage and multi-shot. This is important because we want to stack as much multi-shot as we can, so we're in galvanized chamber and primary frostbite. The reason for this is because it synergizes very well with Metamorphic magazine. Instead of having to fire 20 bullets, well, what if we get up to a multi-shot value of 4 or something? Then suddenly you only have to hit them with 5 bullets to petrify them, which is great. Because the thing about this mod, which makes it tricky, is that you want to kill things fast in this game. There's a lot of enemies. You want to kill enemies fast. But the problem is, you gotta hit them with a lot of bullets to get them petrified. And if you're hitting them with a lot of bullets and they're not dying, that probably means you're not killing things very fast. So if we can instead increase multi-shot as much as we can, then we can get the petrify effect basically immediately, with just a couple of bullets. And then we can still ramp up damage and still get the effect, which is nice. So obviously, increased fire rate is good, punch through is good, because that means you can hit a lot of enemies at the same time if they're standing in a row. Since we are using primary frostbite and not primary merciless, that means that we are not increasing our base damage, so this build does need to run serration, because you need to increase your base damage somehow. The Prismagorgon has a very high crit chance, so with Point Strike we get up to 75%, which means this is a build where you definitely want to use Hunter Munitions. And of course, Galvanize Aptitude, we have 4 different statuses: Impact, Puncture, / Cold. And it gives a pretty big buff to your status chance as well. And you do want a lot of cold procs to hit, because that increases the buff from primary frostbite. And the crit damage buff from primary frostbite is the same one as you get from running Vital Sense. So we're actually not running Vital Sense in this build, just Point Strike. And finally, I'm running Primed Rifle Ammo Mutation just to make sure that I'm never going to run out of ammo. If you feel like ammo is not an issue for you, then by all means just pick Vigilante Supplies instead, so that you still get some extra ammo pickups, but also a chance to enhance your crits, and this thing crits pretty often. So that's the actual build of the weapon, but when I looked at the text and the description, it says that it petrifies enemies, which obviously made me think, is this just Petrify? Is this just Atlas' ability, Petrify? Here. He can petrify enemies, turn them into stone. And then he can punch them and they break into rubble and all of that jazz. And I asked myself, is this Petrify? In that case, does it behave the same way as Petrify does? So I have run a couple of tests to answer the most interesting questions. Test number 1. When enemies that are petrified by this mod die, do they drop rubble for Atlas to build up his armor? And the answer is yes. Yes, they do. If you petrify enemies with this weapon and you gun them down while they're petrified, they do leave rubble that Atlas can pick up, just as if they had been affected by his petrify skill. Test number 2. Enemies that are petrified and then killed by this gun while they are petrified, does it trigger Orgaze? Orgaze is an augment mod for Atlas that turns him into a so-called loot frame. Petrified enemies have a chance to drop additional loot when killed. And unlike with Necros and his Desecrate, this does scale with ability strength, so if you have a hefty amount of ability strength, then as you can see here, you get a pretty high extra drop chance for loot. This goes up as high as 75%. To test this theory, I went to Steel Path, I went to Eris, I just felt like just playing as some Infested. I picked the Exterminate mission, I ran it 10 times, first while only killing enemies with the Prismagorgon and nothing else. Not with my companion, not with my abilities, not with any other weapon. Just the Prismagorgon with Orgaze equipped on Atlas. Test number 2, I ran the exact same mission, this time making sure to not kill petrified enemies and instead killing them with other weapons. I also made sure to not break any resource containers whatsoever, so to not skew the results. And I tried to always stick to the same amount of kills, killing approximately 100 enemies on every run. I ran the mission 10 times, and the results are interesting. We can see that across the board, for basically all drops, be it carbides, be it cubic diodes, be it plastids, be it nanospores, across the board, the Prismagorgon build actually did get increased loot drops. And I know running the mission 10 times with and without the build, I understand that that might not be enough to be conclusive, but I feel like it's still, you know, statistically significant at that point, where it averages out to such a much higher amount that I'm pretty confident in saying that yes, it does in fact trigger Orgaze. And we're going to come to that one. We're going to return to this because that's what actually makes this weapon interesting. Next couple of tests, let's see how it interacts with certain enemies. Number 1, does it work on bosses? And the answer is yes, it does work on bosses. I tested it against Vayhek. I tested it against the Razorback itself. It does work. Now, bosses have adaptive abilities when it comes to Warframe abilities, especially just when it comes to base petrify, because you can't like just perma-petrify enemies. So it works the first time you cast it, or it works not as long as it does when you cast it against a normal enemy, but it works for like a couple of seconds. Second time you do it, it only works maybe 1 second. Third time you do it, maybe it only works like half a second. And eventually it kind of just stops working entirely, or you stutter the enemies, where they're like momentarily frozen and then unfreeze. It's still kind of effective as a way of like disrupting enemies from doing certain attacks, or just, I don't know. But it's obviously not as effective as using it against normal enemies. Does it work against Kuvaliches and Sisters of Parvos? Yes, but even worse. They have even stronger adaptation abilities, as it were, so it doesn't take long until it just completely stops being effective. Does it work against Acolytes? Same thing here, and like thematically it sort of works. They have been blessed by sentient power, right? They have sentient adaptive abilities, and with sentience it's the same thing. This thing works worse and worse and worse every time you hit them with the effect, until it basically stops working. Does it work against Eidolons? No. No, it does not. It does nothing against Eidolons. They are immune to this ability. Important one, does it work against Eximus units? And the answer is yes, but only after you have removed their overguard. So long as the Eximus unit still has overguard, they are immune to the interaction. As soon as the overguard disappears, they are going to become petrified by your gun. So that's kinda where we're at with just how you can use it against certain enemies. It works against normal enemies, it kinda-ish works against bosses, sorta-ish against Acolytes, a bit, with various effectiveness. It does not work against Eidolons. But coming back to Orgaze specifically, what actually makes this interesting is because now you have a loot gun. You have a loot gun because Atlas Petrify is Atlas Helminth ability. If you have Atlas Petrify infused onto your Warframe, you don't even have to cast Petrify. You just have to have Petrify and Orgaze on your Warframe, and then just go around and kill people with the Prisma Gorgon, and you will get slightly more loot than you otherwise would get. So long as you don't kill them too fast, they have to get petrified before they die, or you won't get the extra loot. Which is why we're ramping up multi-shot as much as we can, so that they get petrified as quickly as possible. Now, this is specifically interesting because you can combine it with other loot frames. Now, I'm not gonna recommend using Necros for this. And that is because these two abilities, Necros' Desecrate and Petrify, they kind of have anti-synergy with each other. The reason for that is because Necros, he kinda wants to get as many corpses as possible so that he can loot extra from corpses, because Necros' ability is a loot on corpse. There is the Ripkas, which is a weapon that was made for Necros. It has a specific mod called Amalgam Ripkas True Steel that has 100% gore chance, which increases the chance that you are going to cut enemies into multiple pieces when you kill them. You don't even have to kill them with your Ripkas. You just have to have the Ripkas on, and this applies to all his weapons. Otherwise, it's like slash damage that you use to gore stuff and rip corpses into multiple pieces. If you kill stuff with the Ripkas or other slash weapons and you slash the corpse into multiple pieces, then you're gonna get multiple corpses that can trigger his Desecrate. And then you get more loot. The problem is that does not work with petrified enemies. If an enemy has become petrified and turned to stone and then they just shatter, that's only going to be one corpse and it cannot be slashed into multiple corpses. So unfortunately, Necros is the wrong loot frame for this interaction. What you're going to be looking at is either Hydroid or Cora. They don't have loot on corpse, like Necros does. They instead have loot on death. So, if you kill an enemy that is petrified, that is also like loot on death. And if you kill an enemy that is either trapped inside of Hydroid's tentacles, together with Pilfering Swarm, or inside of Cora's Strangledome, together with Pilfering Strangledome, then you will get the bonuses for both of them. Now there is something I need to specify here, because I'm going to show you how these interactions work. If you petrify enemies, and then cast your Tentacle Swarm, you will see that the petrified enemies are not grabbed by the tentacles. It's only when the petrify effect wears off that the tentacles can actually grab them. That's number one. Number two is, if we cast this again, even though, you know, I'm supposed to be petrifying them right now when they're in the pentacles, as you can see, the petrify effect is not happening. As far as we can see, they are not being petrified. So this might be discouraging to you. And you might say that like, oh, see, this interaction doesn't work. Actually, it does. So what this is, this effect, it's one of the status effects in Warframe that's a bit more esoteric. It's called Ragdoll, and there are a couple of different abilities that can give enemies the Ragdoll status. Both Hydroid's Tentacles and Cora's Strangledome give enemies the Ragdoll status. Now, I have infused Atlas here with another ability that can Ragdoll enemies, which is Nidus Larva. So I want to show you something. First up, let's group all the enemies with my Zaw. There we go. Second up, let's armor strip them. Okay. So, Atlas, when he kills petrified enemies, he gains rubble. So if I cast Larva on these guys and then cast Petrify, I'm going to show you. First Larva, and now Petrify. Same thing here, as you can see. You did not get a visual effect for petrification. It did not actually look as if anyone had gotten petrified. But Larva, Petrify, kill them. And as you can see in the bottom right corner, I just got armor. I just got rubble armor. Because even though you couldn't see that they were petrified, they were in fact petrified. Otherwise I would not have gotten rubble armor for killing them. So it is a visual effect that you can't see that they are getting petrified while they're being ragdolled. But they are, in fact, under the effect of Petrify, which means they are under the effect of Orgaze, and you will get additional loot for killing them. So what's nice about this is simply the fact that, like, if you have enemies in the tentacles or in Cora's Strangledome and trying to, like, cast Petrify on them, it's, like, basically impossible. You just can't get it to hit. But now, if you have enemies in your tentacles, you can just pop, 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 and this is all. This is about as many bullets as you need to hit them with. You can see in the top right corner how much I am racking up my cold status effects with my arcane, simply from the stupid amounts of multi-shot. And you are in fact petrifying enemies while you're doing this, and this is going to give you extra loot, even more than you were before. So if you are playing a Hydroid or a Cora with either Pilfering Swarm or Pilfering Strangledome, I suggest, why not add Petrify to your loadout? Why not add Orgaze to your loadout? And the Prismagorgon with Metamorphic Magazine and you just took your loot frame and made it double loot frame. So ultimately, this is where I see the usefulness of this mod really potentially finding its place inside the Warframe meta. As it were, the Gorgon is like, it's still probably not going to be a meta weapon with this. It's interesting, it's a cool mod, and the ability to just sort of stun lock enemies is kind of rad. To that effect, I enjoy building the weapon around cold damage, because it just feels very thematically appropriate to slow enemies to a crawl, to just halt them in place and ultimately petrify them. It feels thematically cool. It just feels cool. It's nice. But there are obviously still other weapons that are just going to be killing things a lot faster than this will. But as a grinding tool, as a way of getting more loot, is where I can sort of actually see this working and becoming useful, because it's Petrify. It's literally just casting Petrify on enemies without having to spend the energy to cast Petrify. I don't know, maybe you're one of those guys who just doesn't have like a arcane energize or something yet, or you're just struggling with energy economy. Well, this is great, because now you can subsume Atlas in the Helmin system, and you can just give Petrify to any Warframe you want and put Orgaze in there and use this gun. Just kill enemies with this gun. You don't even have to do the Hydroid and Core thing. Just pick any Warframe, run Petrify, Orgaze, this gun, and Metamorphic magazine. Kill enemies with this gun, and you are going to be getting more loot drops than you were before. Which is not bad in a game where you're always hunting for more resources, always looting and grinding. If you ask me, that's the real value of this mod. And that is real value. That makes this like probably the most interesting like Nightwave augment mod that they've ever put in the game. This might actually be important to some people. If you have not yet grinded Nightwave, it is on rank 23. You gotta go pretty high up, all the way up to 23. That's where Metamorphic magazine is. And remember, if you clear out an entire week's worth of challenges, it's gonna reload previous week's challenges that you have not yet done. So you have ample time. This Nightwave season is gonna go on for a lot longer. Make sure to get Metamorphic magazine, because this one is actually interesting. So, that's the video, people. Hope you enjoyed my little analysis of this mod. And I'll see you again tomorrow for something completely different.